I'm showing you some popsicle plants here that were right outside my office window in the past few days. And I'm looking forward to spring. And you may not tell that from the fact that I'm talking about all the sicknesses that can happen to your crops. But the basic idea here is that we're going to be looking at the various things that can happen to your spring crops so that you're educated so that they won't happen to your spring crops. You'll be vigilant and you'll keep them from occurring. A lot of times just knowledge is all you need. And then sometimes you need to know what to throw away so that it doesn't spread. We'll start out with some bacteria. There are a number of bacterial diseases that can affect your crops. One of the most common on a bedding plant is the one that affects zinnias. And it's a very classic look on this plant. You'll see spots on the leaves, but they're not round spots, they're angular spots because the veins are bounding the movement of the bacteria in the leaf. The bacteria can't flow across the veins. So you see this very patchy look. In this image, you'll notice that there is no yellow halo at all on the right. That's perfectly possible, but it's also quite typical with bacterial diseases for there to be a yellow halo or a yellow chlorotic area around the leaf spots. The specific one that goes after zinnia is fairly specific, Xanthomonas campestris pathovirus zinniae. I do think it can go into tomatoes, so don't assume these things are necessarily totally exclusive in terms of what they can go to. We're learning a lot more about how promiscuous bacteria can be. One of the nice things is that we have advanced to having some alternative kinds of zinnia besides just Zinnia elegans. If you purchase, for example, Zinnia marylandica, which would include things like the Profusion series, you'll get resistance in those to the Xanthomonas disease, and also along with that, some resistance to powdery mildew and Alternaria. The Zahara series is another example of that Zinnia marylandica. There's also the Star series and the Crystal series, which are Zinnia angustifolia, which means narrow-leaved, and they're going to also give you very good disease resistance. So the types of zinnias you grow may make your job a lot easier. This I put in as a generic look of what a bacterial leaf spot might look like as well. They're not always cute little blocky lesions in the leaves. Sometimes bacterial lesions are wet, black to tan areas at the edge of the leaf. And the distribution's important. Obviously, this sort of injury could just be from a dry down or something like that. But there's a certain look to a bacterial infection that can include this because of infection through the hydothodes. So if the bacteria get in at the edge of the leaf, it can look something like this. And here you're looking at a chrysanthemum disease that's pretty common, caused by Pseudomonas cercospora. This same bacterium can actually infect a number of your other bedding plants. We don't see this kind of thing very often, but if you have really wet conditions, it's possible. So this is one of the many reasons why you want to keep leaf wetness to a minimum, because it reduces the sort of odds and ends of Pseudomonas infections you might get in your crops. Here's another illustration on the mum, and in this case, there can be direct infections of the flower buds as well as infections on the leaves. The good thing about the mum infections is that they're usually limited to just a few cultivars, and they tend to show up sort of midsummer rather than as a spring disease problem. One of the more recent diseases that we've seen in the bacterial category is one on dianthus, and hopefully you can make out here there's some tiny tan oval spots on some of those younger leaves up towards the top of the plant, as well as some completely blighted leaves and some yellowing. That's the look of a Pseudomonas andropogonus that can affect dianthus, but also goes to some other plants. And you certainly would never be able to predict that the same bacteria that can go to dianthus will also go to blueberry and baby's breath, but it's the case. And it can also go to sweet corn. Probably this list reflects that we don't know everything it can do. I suspect it has other places it can go as well. One of the more well-known diseases in previous decades was this on geranium. It was a very prevalent problem back in the 1950s, and it has increasingly reduced itself because of better sanitation in the industry. We've also certainly gotten away from field-grown stock plants for geraniums. With the Xanthomonas on geranium, you're going to see individual leaf spots that are about 1/16 of an inch across. You'll see some yellowing. You'll see some V-shaped lesions, and it will look a little bit like botrytis infections, but different, particularly because you'll have those little tiny round spots at locations of stomates around the leaf. So this has been renamed now. It's now considered Xanthomonas hortorum pathovar pelargonii, but this is your basic bacterial blight organism. There's a second bacterial disease on geraniums that is considered even more ferocious than the one I just showed you. This one is Ralstonia solanaceae aurum. It's the name of the pathogen, and we usually just refer to the disease in the trade as Ralstonia. It involves not individual leaf spots, but more of a wilt infection without leaf spots. You can get wilting when you have Xanthomonas in geraniums, but with Ralstonia in geraniums, you can only see wilting. So the illustration here is pretty indicative. Portions of a leaf will turn pale and the tissue will get sort of grayish and limp, and that will progress from the bottom to the top of the plant with one leaf after another. This is not a common sight at all. It's just that it's a very serious disease. This organism is considered a select agent by the federal government because it can also affect potatoes, causing a disease that really destroys potato plants. So the government regulates it very tightly, and you don't want the disease because your crop basically needs to be destroyed if you run into this problem. There was some of it this past season, and that was the first time for many years. So we're hoping that the sanitation standards have gone right back up to the top again, and we won't see it again for years and years. I don't think there will be a problem with it this season. And let's hope my prediction is correct. To further show you a little bit of the symptoms that you can see with the Ralstonia disease, up at the top you have something similar to what I just showed you, yellowing and wilting of several leaves on a plant. And at the bottom, this curious symptom that some of the growers noticed last summer, where the leaves would wilt, but they would wilt up. And that's not something you normally see on a geranium. So if you ever see that symptom, be suspicious of Ralstonia. And certainly if you see symptoms like on the above plant here, consider that there might be a root rot problem. Check and see if the roots are rotten. Obviously, wilting can come from rotten roots as well as from one of these bacterial diseases that are systemic. Other plants can also have bacterial diseases. We have seen in recent years problems with begonias, where there will be infections again at those hydothodes on the outer edge of the leaf, and it will have a very classic look to it. And I'm hoping you can pick that up from this image. There will be a brown, roughly V-shaped area, but there will also be sort of little freckles on it. The leading margin of the infected area will have little pinpoint darker dots to it, and also some chlorosis. So that's the way I know to suspect a bacterial problem in a begonia that's caused by Xanthomonas axonopodus pathovar begonii. Here's a little bit more practice at that, larger lesions, but with that speckled yellow margin to them. Again, you're talking about a plant that can have botrytis infections, so it can be hard to tell the two things apart. But the yellowing and the dotting really helps you know you might have a bacterial problem. And here's a plug showing symptoms with, again, even more extensive chlorosis, and you can see the breakdown in the center of the leaf. It really is starting to tell you it's a systemic infection. With botrytis, you have a much sharper margin to the dead areas. It does have a different look and has a more zonate look to it. There are also bacterial diseases that you'll see on ornamental pepper plants, or if you're growing peppers and tomatoes in the greenhouse at the same time that you're growing flowers, there can be seed-borne problems on peppers and tomatoes. And this very common disease that they share can be caused by 4 different bacteria. They've just learned recently. For years, we thought it was just one. But there are, again, bacteria that can get into the greenhouse that are pretty versatile, that can go after more than one plant and can probably team up to cause more disease problems. Here's a picture of an ornamental pepper with some leaf lesions. There are some key points to managing bacterial diseases. We don't have as many chemical solutions to them, but watching them carefully is important. If you know you have a plant that's prone to a bacterial disease, scout it not once a week, but maybe twice a week. Minimize your leaf wetness and reduce splashing to any degree you can. The chemicals that you can work with are copper materials and cease or anything else that has a Bacillus subtilis type active ingredient to it. Throw out your affected plants quickly so that they're not there for splashing to spread the bacteria. and do clean up after the crop so that you're not keeping around any organic debris with the bacteria in it. That helps the bacteria to survive in the greenhouse. On the surface of the bench, they're not going to survive very well. And here's your treatment materials. Also, occasionally, particularly with mums and tomatoes, you might have the option of using Agristrep, which is a streptomycin material. You can't use that generally across your flower crops, but depending on what you're trying to treat, that might be an option. Okay, moving from bacteria to fungi. Right at the top of this, of course, is botrytis, which really appreciates our sort of iffy spring weather in the Northeast. When it's gray and cloudy and rainy and drizzly, botrytis is very happy. It does well over a long temperature range, particularly likes 55 degrees Fahrenheit, let's say, which is often a temperature we have in the greenhouse. And you can have direct infection of leaves. It's not all that easy. I have to work hard at it. When I do an experiment, I put a tent over the plants and use humidification from a little room humidifier to get it wet enough in there for it to happen. But in a commercial greenhouse, things are packed in there and it's a lot easier, unfortunately, for you. The dead areas allow the fungus to sporulate, so you'll get what's called gray mold, the growth of the fungus on the tissue that it has killed, or tissue that anything else has killed, actually. So this is probably your most common threat, and you'll want to remove tissue that looks like this so that it's not there to produce spores to affect the rest of the plants. You certainly want to manage the environment to keep the wetness down as much as possible. You want your humidity below 80% all the time, at least below 85%. And there's certain of the fungicides that are helpful against botrytis in particular. Decree is one that's relatively gentle to plant tissue and relatively safe to use on plants. It's worked very nicely against botrytis, but with a little bit of resistance problem in some cases. Daconil continues to have no resistance problems, and it's very strong against botrytis, but you have to be careful how you work with it and not spray wet plants and not add other things to it, because that might lead to some injury from the Daconil component. And use it under good drying conditions. Those are all helpful concepts. The Chipco 26 GT works against botrytis, and Palladium works well against botrytis. And you may all have other favorites besides this little list. Alternaria is a different fungus that causes leaf infections. It has sort of an interesting spore, so I'm showing you one here. It's not actually germinating in this case. The spores of Alternaria have beaks to them, so they're curious looking things. They can cause spots that look a lot of different ways, but I noticed the ones I'm showing you look fairly similar to one another. Here you have little tan areas on celosia leaves with a reddish border. The red's coming from the plant's defense against the Alternaria fungus. Here you see broader areas that are brown, which are on Dusty Miller, that's infected with Alternaria. This was a seed-borne disease. Here you have Alternaria leaf spots on marigold with that same sort of purple rim tan center to them. And here you have Alternaria leaf spot on Impatiens, which is the one I've seen the most often. Realize that when you're using Downy mildew resistant Impatiens now, they do not have resistance to Alternaria leaf spot. So you still need to manage for the other things, even if your Downy mildew management will be easier. So watch for these sort of purple rim tan lesions and Impatiens, and I would throw away the plants with it and treat the ones around them to reduce the disease. The fungus Cercospora is another one of the leaf spotters that you might run into. This slide showing you the spores, which are long and light brown with many cells. This disease is, well, a different species of this same fungus is quite common on beets. I probably wouldn't have given this one a red ribbon at the fair, because you might be able to make out there one of the leaves is just covered with these purple rim leaf spots, which detract from the beauty of a beet plant, but don't hurt the food in any way. Here's a very similar looking spot that you might see in crops of, in this case, a bounce Impatiens. I've only seen this twice, but it's a possibility under wet conditions, so watch for this and don't let it get going. And then the disease that has been appearing this season, I guess it's probably the second time I've seen it, is a Cercospora leaf spot on begonia, where you have brown lesions sometimes along the outer edge of the leaf, sometimes scattered into the center of the leaf, but with a thin, bright yellow rim to it. And this is not the look of botrytis on a begonia because of that bright yellow edge to the leaf lesions that we tend to call a halo. Another plant that has years ago had a dreadful problem with Cercospora leaf spots was pansy. I have not seen it in recent years, but it could come back if it were to get into production, particularly if it were to get into the seed. This disease does not seem to be well controlled without strobilurin type fungicides. So if you do run into a problem with pansies or violas or any of the other plants I'm mentioning, I would look to the FRAC group 11 or to one of the new combination materials that has FRAC group 11 plus 7 to get control of that problem. Moving into other possibilities in the spring greenhouse, there are the mildews. And there are two different kinds of mildew. And just to review for you, they're very different from one another. The powdery mildews are caused by fungi that all look alike. They're white and powdery on the upper surface of the leaf, but they're actually often very host-specific things. The downy mildew is not a true fungus. It's called an oomycete or a water mold, and it's actually a closer relative of Pythium and Phytophthora. Both of them are moved around by wind or splashing. The usual location of the fuzziness of the fungus growth is on the top for the powdery mildew, and it's usually on the undersurface of the leaf for the downy mildew. So which side of the leaf you see it on often helps you separate it. The powdery mildew is not usually a systemic disease in any of the crops that we're dealing with. It can be systemic in tree buds sometimes, but you're going to see it as a leaf by leaf problem in your greenhouse crops. The downy mildew you're going to see causing individual leaf spots and also being a systemic infection. The sad truth is that you're going to have epidemics and problems with resistance in either case. Both of these produce lots of inoculum, so they can be big epidemic problems in your greenhouse. So you want to be able to recognize them very quickly and start treating against them so that you don't have a big loss in your crops. Some of the ones that are prone to downy mildew are listed here. You probably know some of these: coleus and impatiens and roses. Sunflowers and rudbeckia get the same downy mildew. Snapdragons are quite prone to a downy mildew. And then I just ran out of space, so I lumped these others together, but things like strawflowers and pansies and alyssum and stock and geum, veronica, lamium, salvia, bacopa, hellebores, agastache, digitalis, bacopa. There are other possibilities. So if you only know 3 downy mildew diseases today, keep your mind open that you might run into one on another crop some other time. Here's the look of the rose downy mildew. I don't usually think of this as a bedding plant, but some of you might produce them in the spring. And it's just an easy thing actually to get wrong, because the areas that the downy mildew infects look like spray injuries, and they look different each time also. The most diagnostic symptom is that the leaves fall off, and that's sort of too late to recognize it. So watch for symptoms that are just blotchy brown or purple areas, and think about what you've sprayed recently and whether you think you might have a spray injury. And if you're not guilty of that, realize that you might have a downy mildew and look on the undersurface of the leaf and see if you can see any sporulation. It can be very sparse with rose downy mildew. You can see a little bit of stuff on that lesion up at the top there. But I'm noticing on the roses like Knockout and the more recent ones that have been popular, sometimes it's sporulating more, so it's easier to identify than on a hybrid tea rose. One of the newer diseases in this category is one that affects cleome. And this is my new favorite downy mildew disease. And I'm allowed to have this one as a favorite because the Latin name has been named after me. So I have Daughtrey as the species on this particular downy mildew. So if you see this one, tell me about it. I'm always happy to hear it's out there. It's a very rare thing. I don't think you'll see it, but it is something that can affect cleome either in the greenhouse or in landscape plantings. Snapdragons have traditionally had a terrible problem with downy mildew. And here what we're showing you is the seedlings, because it is a seed-borne disease, and the seedlings with the problem are very shrunken. They're quite stunted. They're a little gnarly, a little pale. And if you were to see something like this, you'd know to get them right out of there and treat the rest against downy mildew infection. On an older plant, you'll see large areas covered with gray to violet spore masses on the undersurface. And then the top of the plant gets very, very chlorotic, very yellow. And you can see some leaves there at the top of the slide looking extremely yellow because there's systemic invasion of the top of the snapdragon plant. Here's a hellebore. just to convince you that yes, indeed, the perennials have a potential problem with downy mildew too, and it will go on to be a problem year after year in the landscape if you can't eliminate it in your greenhouse production. This one is showing something that has that characteristic I told you was a bacterial leaf spot. It's very much bounded by the veins, and that's characteristic of downy mildew infections as well. Here's lamium, which is a classic plant for having downy mildew infection, but it also is a classic plant for having foliar nematodes. And in either case, you're going to see little purplish spots that have sort of squarish outlines to them. So if you saw something like this, you'd need the help of a lab to help you identify it, or you could at least look at the undersurface of the leaf and see if you see anything that looks like downy mildew sporulation before you jump to the conclusion about which problem you have. Another common bedding plant crop where we have to be alarmed if we run into downy mildew is coleus. And I have seed-borne question mark here because at times it seems as if it's seed-borne, but we grow so much coleus vegetatively that I think most of the time it's being spread by vegetative propagation, by movement of cuttings through the industry. You can have little tiny speck type spots with coleus downy mildew, or you can have larger blocky tan lesions as you see at the right here. Both are a downy mildew symptom. It can be a tricky kind of thing to identify. And again, as with roses, the most clear-cut way to know you have downy mildew on a coleus is when all the leaves fall off. But this doesn't happen very often, and it is too late to do anything about it. So do keep in mind that watching for leaf spotting and checking the undersurface of the leaf is a better way to go. With coleus downy mildew, the spores are a little bit grayish, so the undersurface of the leaf does look downy and looks a little dirty from the downy mildew. Here's a wasabi coleus with those blocky areas in the foliage. Here they're yellow rather than brown. That's perfectly possible. And the undersurface of the leaf would eventually get coated with downy mildew sporulation. And just to prove that there's something funny about the way the names work, here's actual wasabi being grown by a little greens producer, a microgreens producer. And hopefully you can see the downiness on the undersurface of those cotyledons. That's the sporulation of a downy mildew that was seed-borne in this crop. It certainly wouldn't be able to go to a coleus, but I thought it was sort of funny that I'd seen it on wasabi and on wasabi coleus. Here's the look of downy mildew on sunflower. This is one called Plasmopora halstedii, and it causes these large yellow patches in the foliage of systemically infected sunflower. And you need to turn the leaf over to look for the white growth of the downy mildew on the undersurface to realize what you've got. This is not something you're going to see early on in a greenhouse crop. Sometimes these are grown as a finished flowering pot plant. It's more likely to be seen mid to late season in an outdoor crop. But I mention it to you because the organism is the same one that can go to Rudbeckias. And you certainly don't want to have infection of Rudbeckia that will go out into the landscape, allowing downy mildew to keep coming back for the customers and making them unhappy. The downy mildew on a Rudbeckia will cause a yellow or a purplish dead area on the top of the leaf. So turn a leaf over if you see anything like that and check for the downy mildew sporulation. Then the disease that's been the worst problem for everyone is the one that affects the Impatiens, the downy mildew that affects Impatiens. So here's a before and after picture for you. This is July 1, and here's September 15th of the same year. There are no longer any flowers, there are no longer any leaves, and if you wait a little while, there won't even be stems because they'll keel over as well. It's really not a disease we can tolerate in the landscape in the Northeast. It's caused by a downy mildew called Plasmopora destructor. It's actually been on the books for many years. It was in the United States in the late 1800s. It was collected then. We have old herbarium specimens of it. But it seemed to take on a new life for whatever reason in the 2000s. And it's had a huge impact on impatient sales and desirability for both growers and customers. The good news is that we've now got some resistant plants within 10 years of seeing the problem. There are two series. There's the Beacon series from Ball Pan Am, and there's also the Imera XDR series from Syngenta. and they possess wonderful high levels of resistance to the downy mildew. This is an illustration from a trial that I did a couple of years ago, where you can see at the top a red beacon plant that still has flowers, still has leaves. It was grown side by side with something like an accent white at the bottom that's just like not there anymore. It's melted out completely over the same period of time. There's a huge difference in the level of resistance. And here's another example of that. The beacon Impatiens come in a number of colors, and they have very high resistance to the disease. And here's some of the Imera XDR germplasm in this form of a white, which is one of the colors that seems to be particularly susceptible to the downy mildew. You have the Imera XDR white down here at the bottom on July 16th. And the plants were exposed to inoculum on May 31st, and you can see the accent white and the super alphin white are just stems, and they're growing side by side with the Imera. So we've had huge progress in this, and I think you no longer have to be scared to grow Impatiens. But I have an additional message here that I really want the people who are growing in frost-free areas to be mindful of the fact that the plants are still susceptible. It's not that they can't get downy mildew at all. It's that they get it less easily and they get it less extensively, and their symptoms are much reduced. But you don't want to be bringing plants into your greenhouse that have downy mildew on them. And there were some problems with this last year. The highly resistant plants can still have some infection, and it can cause some yellowing on the foliage, which makes them very unpleasant for you to be growing. This is an example of a beacon white that you can perhaps see is dropping some leaves that has the downy mildew infection. And it's not something that I've seen happening in material produced here in the Northeast very often, but last season there was a bit of it. So don't assume that because there's resistance in the plants, they can't get the problem at all. There is the possibility of infection. Here's a double-flowered Impatiens that was grown in the same greenhouse with some of the highly resistant ones last year. And hopefully you can make out the plant on the right has that systemic infection within the leaf of a downy mildew, which is why it's so yellow. And in this instance, we think the downy mildew moved from the double-flowered Impatiens, that's a vegetatively produced plant, over into the resistant beacons or XDRs. And here's the strange thing about this disease: the upper surface of the leaf doesn't necessarily look too bad. You've got a healthy leaf at the left here, 3 that are looking a little curled, a little small, and a little pale, but when you turn those leaves over, you can see there's downy mildew there. So be curious. If you're growing Impatiens and you think you're seeing something a little out of the ordinary on your resistant Impatiens lines, do check them. And my main point is that I think you need to work with some fungicides to produce these safely. You can't assume that they don't need a little fungicidal support. And so you might want to work with things like Segovus or the strobilurins, or Aliette or the other phos acid type materials, or Stature or Mycora or Mancozeb in a rotation to help buck up the natural genetic resistance that's in those resistant Impatiens. Thinking back to all the different downy mildews, I'll show you a longer list that's not so specific to Impatiens. There are a number of materials that are labeled for downy mildew that are organic, but I don't want you to rely on them unless you absolutely have to, because they have much weaker control against the downy mildew. So although you can work with things like the copper materials or regalia or the neem oil or Bacillus subtilis materials or oxidate or actinovate, you're not going to get immense amounts of benefit from them. So you need to use them at short intervals and have really good suppressive environments if you're going to grow a downy mildew prone plant. If, however, you can use traditional chemistry, there's some very effective materials against downy mildew. And that includes the polyoxin D and the thiazofamide materials. And again, the phos acid, the dimethylmorph or mendopropamide, the fluopicolide, mefenoxam, oxythiopiperlin, and mancozeb. And another point to make here is that with 2 of these products, the Adorn or the Subdue Max, you're required to tank mix them with something else that's effective when you use them against downy mildew. So make sure you're paying attention to that ruling that's on the label of the materials. and I'm going fast through this because I know you have a copy of it, so please don't panic if you haven't realized that you have a copy of the talk available to you. You can go back to that to get your fungicide details. This is the same information, just arranged a little differently so that I could make another point to you. These are materials used for downy mildew that should be used in rotation, and they're arranged according to their groups. So make sure you realize that the same frac group means that you're not rotating if you go from one to the other. The group 11 materials, for example, are really useful against downy mildews, but you can't rotate Compass with Heritage. It's pointless. They're putting the same active ingredient out in terms of the plant's sense of things and the downy mildew sense of things. And the other group that's extremely useful here is the group of the materials that are down here in the Stature SC or Orvego or Mycora group. They're particularly good, and I probably should highlight the Segovas as well. All three give you particularly good effect against the downy mildews. And if you would like a rotational partner with things like that, Mancozeb is especially good against downy mildew too. It's not systemic. You need to have good coverage, but it would be a very strong player if you're trying to get good downy mildew management for your crops. And we're moving into powdery mildews, which are the alternate type of mildew that can be involved. We tend to think a lot about them on the flowering potted plants, things that you might be producing later in the season, and also outdoors, we think of them as a late summer to fall disease. But there are some cases where they can be a problem for you in the spring bedding plant production, especially, for example, if you tend to grow some 4-inch, 6-inch pots towards the end of your production where you've had the plants in there a little longer. The conditions can become quite nice for the powdery mildews. This is Zinnia, for example. You might run into typical powdery mildew growth on foliage of certain Zinnia cultivars. They're not all real prone to it, but always it's good to check what plant pathologists are working with. This is Magellan Orange. I find it really great for my experiments, and maybe you can draw a conclusion from that. Here's a dahlia, which might not be something that you would be thinking about, but I do see that in the spring getting powdery mildew at times if there's a source of inoculum. These pale areas, if you look at them closely, are showing fungus growth across the surface of the plant tissue. I'm also noticing that powdery mildew likes to hide from growers. So here's an instance of Rex begonias, which have what look like little greasy spots. You might think bacteria or spray injury or something like that. But if you look real closely at those spots, you can see the growth of a powdery mildew across the surface. So never forget that begonias are prone to powdery mildew, and that might be what you're seeing if you see any symptom at all. So look closely. On sedums, I think you have the most challenging of the powdery mildews to identify. On sedum, you have a scabby spot rather than a really obvious white fluffy colony most of the time. So look closely again there, and you might need a dissecting microscope to examine the surface of brown areas to see powdery mildew crawling across the surface of the leaf. And every once in a while, there'll be a flower infection with powdery mildew that can fool you. This is a Gerber showing tan spots in the petals. Hey, that happens to be powdery mildew infection on the petals. And you can't even see there's anything white there because they're white petals. That's the look of infection on that plant. And you might see a very different look if it was a red petaled plant. But usually there's also some leaves to check. And on a Gerber, there can be a real white growth of the fungus across the upper surface of the leaf. And it's putting its little suckers into the epidermal cells and taking nutrition from those. So when you think you're seeing something, look at other parts of the plant, look at other plants, try to put it together so you can form a good diagnosis. One of the plants that has in earlier years had a terrible problem with powdery mildew is Verbena. And I think the industry has done a very good job of getting rid of cultivars that are prone to the problem so that it's much safer to grow them now than it was some time ago. But there is a fungus called Podosphaera xanthii that affects Verbena and also cucurbit type crops, which shows up occasionally. And there's a real difference from one cultivar plant to another and how susceptible they are. But it's hard to notice it because often the plants are in hanging baskets. They might even be above your head. And it's the lower foliage that shows it during the spring months. So periodically do check and make sure you don't have yellowing or purpling or heaven forbid, actual obvious white on the surface of those lower leaves, because it can be really troublesome on some of the cultivars. We did a trial in, I guess year before last, looking at some of the powdery mildews, and it was reassuring that a lot of the ones that we tested from a number of different suppliers were quite resistant to the disease, and even ones that that had 1 or 2 leaf spots are probably not much of a problem, but when you get coating of powdery mildew, it can be really horrendous. We've learned over years of testing that when you go from one series to another, the powdery mildew does not really show a pattern of affecting one series and not another series. The powdery mildew often will affect one color in one series and a different color in another series. So if you have a problem with powdery mildew one year in a verbena, I would just suggest you don't grow that cultivar the next year. There's probably another one in another series that you could use to fill in and just not have the aggravation of the mildew control. You probably are familiar with the fact that powdery mildews form just one type of spore that moves around in air currents in the greenhouse most of the time, but it also has a second type of spore that's shown here as little black specks on this phlox leaf, phlox being one of its favorite hosts. We're used to a lot of cultivars being resistant now to phlox. And again, I think as with verbena, our ability to grow things has improved because the industry has weeded out some of the more susceptible of the plants. And that's making things much better for gardeners as well. And certainly check this list from Richard Hawkey that talks about the different phlox and which ones are prone when you're picking which ones to grow. And I just wanted to share with you a story. This winter, we had a strawberry sample, which is not typical in an ornamental lab, but they're very ornamental fruits. And there was some whiteness here on the berries. And I couldn't believe it, but that was actually powdery mildew. And it will go right after the little achenes here, little white fuzz balls on the fruits, and be quite a problem for indoor producers of strawberry this time of year. And I just mentioned to you that we see those black sexual spore cases outdoors on plants that we grow. Well, we found little black spore cases here on the strawberries, even though it was a greenhouse crop. And that I think is because it's being grown at such cold temperatures. So magnified, you can see what interesting little things those are. Those little sexual spore cases are like little Pac-Men, and they each contain one ascus that then develops 8 spores inside that can produce the spring inoculum of a disease like the one that affects the phlox. And we ordinarily don't see that kind of thing in greenhouses. So if any of you are growing strawberries, run look. Maybe you have Chasmothecia on your plants that are part of the life cycle of the fungus you don't usually see in the greenhouse. Here are the chemicals that you would want to work with for powdery mildew control. One thing that you'll notice that's in common is that the strobilurins work very nicely against powdery mildew, just as they work very nicely against downy mildew. And you'll also see the group 3 materials. You have indoors, you'd have the option of working with TerraGuard. And if you're not in New York, you can work with Eagle or Hoist. And Millstop comes in, the potassium bicarbonate. It's very effective, not systemic, but very effective against powdery mildew. And you've got a lot of biologicals that you can bring into play too, and botanicals. So you can work out a very nice rotation using whatever chemistries and biologicals that you like to get your powdery mildew managed on the highly susceptible crops. Okay, rust, another whole category here, another fungus. The rust diseases are noticeable on the undersurface of leaves. So again, I have to ask you to be curious. If you see spotting on something like a geranium leaf, turn it over and make sure you don't see these pustules of reddish brown spores, which are recognizable as a rust disease. Here you see that same kind of symptom on Snapdragon. Snapdragon rust is a big problem. Not usually in the greenhouse, more in the landscape, but you certainly don't want to sell it to anyone. And here's the rust on Sunny Border Blue Veronica. Again, really ugly on the plant, so that would not make it a very saleable commodity. So make sure you're not offering that to your customers. There are 2 on chrysanthemum. This is the one called brown rust, that's Buccinia chrysanthemi, that forms brown concentric rings of pustules on the undersurface. And here you see the one that is more exciting, I think, to the hort inspectors. This is the chrysanthemum white rust. It is not at the level of select agent that the Ralstonia is, but it is a quarantine pest. So again, your hort inspectors and regulators are going to want to make sure you're not selling this disease. So protect against it, and also watch for it. These pale spots are what you see on the upper surface, and rather than a rusty colored pustule on the underside, with the chrysanthemum white rust, you're going to have a whitish or beige cushion of spores on the undersurface of the leaf. Just a few root and stem diseases before I let you question me. One has become more important recently, so I wanted to make sure to tell you about that. It's a sclerotinia blight that can affect a number of different flowering potted plants. It's not particularly host specific at all. It's very distinctive in a Petri plate because it makes a white cottony growth and then sclerotia form, these hard resistant knots of tissue that are quite big. They look like little mouse turds. And so it's the kind of thing that grows from one plant to the next, somewhat similarly to Rhizoctonia. And I think that would be the most likely thing for you to confuse with it, or perhaps botrytis. Here you're looking down into some baskets on the right-hand side, and you see plants that are wilting and dying from the sclerotinia infection. It could start on one plant and then move over to the one beside it and cause a stem rot. And this is a group of petunias that we work with an experiment a few years ago. Under high humidity, it can move very effectively from one plant to the next if they're touching. Rhizoctonia is a more familiar enemy, and it also works by growing as hyphae from one plant to the next. It's not really about spores or airborne movement or something like that. It's going to be a problem if you don't have good sanitation in your greenhouse, if you're trying to reuse pots and things of that nature. It will be problematic during propagation. It can get into the foliage of plants when you're trying to propagate them. If you don't have a really sanitary situation, you can see a New Guinea Impatiens having a cutting rot. There's also a fungus called Sclerotium rolfsii that you might see occasionally, not so much in bedding plants, probably more in other groups of plants, but it forms little mustard seed shaped sclerotia. Let me say that again, mustard seed shaped sclerotia that start out white and then turn brownish or orangey. And that again could move on your hands from plant to plant the same way the sclerotinia or the Rhizoctonia might. We also know pretty much about Pythium, a very common problem in the greenhouse that will cause wilting of plants, and the roots will decay first. So checking the root system to see how healthy it is if you think you might be seeing some wilting or off color in your crop is very relevant. Looking at a size difference will really let you know that Pythium could be there. This is a case where I was doing it in an experiment, so I know there's Pythium in the pot at the left, not in the pot at the right. But if you have Pythium in everything would look short and you wouldn't realize what was going on. So just directly inspect the roots and make sure they're nice and white when you're growing plants. This kind of thing can be below ground, and if you don't check, you're not going to realize that you have softened, rotted roots on your crop. To manage Pythium, you want really good draining mix. You don't ever want to plant things too deeply. You don't want to over-fertilize because that makes plants more prone to it. You certainly don't want puddles or overwatering. You want to check what's coming in so you're not planting plugs that have a problem. Certainly clean things up. And then the types of fungicides that you work with are very specific to Pythium, and there aren't very many we can work with. We're finding things like Segway, and then which has thiazofamid in it, and also etradiazole as an ingredient, which is found in trubanterazole and banrot, to be the most reliable, to have the least chance of having some sort of a resistance problem when you're trying to combat Pythium. We also have problems with Phytophthora. I'm showing you lavender here. That's one of the crops that people keep trying to grow under wetter conditions than they should, which feeds into a Phytophthora problem. And you use the same kinds of cultural management considerations for Phytophthora, but you do have the benefit of a few more fungicides. So down here at the bottom, you'll see that you can use strobilurin fungicides against Pythium, and you can use mefenoxam, which is Subdue Max, and you can use Segovus, which is oxythiopiperalin, and get very good effect against Phytophthorus. So make sure that you're choosing from the right list if you know which of those two problems you have. Here's more of a summary talking about those kinds of things, your Pythium control materials, your Phytophthora control materials. I should also add stature. I didn't mention that before. Stature is very good against Phytophthora, but really won't touch Pythium, so you need to know that. Then for Rhizoctonia or Fusarium, and we could add Sclerotinia to this list, the kinds of things you can work with are some of the strobilurins, thiophanate methyl, things like Medallion and Terragard. This is a curious looking fungus that you need to be really well aware of. This is the Thalabiopsis, which causes black root rot. It has a new name now. They made it even harder to pronounce. Now it's Berkeliomyces basicula. It will cause uneven stands in your bedding plant. You'll have some plants looking normal, some looking really stunted, and the stunted ones can be purple or chlorotic. Your finished crop can be really miserable looking if you have Thalabiopsis in a given container. You need to keep your pH really down to avoid this problem. You don't want to grow the Thalabiopsis prone crops at a high pH. You want it to be more like 5.5 so that you're not favoring Thalabiopsis. You also don't want the soils wet or the mix wet. You don't want fungus gnats because they'll move it around. And it's really important not to reuse your flats or pots because that fungus is very good at surviving from one year to the next. So you're going to want to use a water jet to knock off all the debris and then use a disinfectant. If you are recycling your containers, keeping your pH down, using well-drained mix, keeping your fungus gnats managed, watching to see if you're bringing in on plugs. And then chemically speaking, you want to work with thiophanate methyl because it's especially good against Thalabiopsis. And then you could rotate in a Firm or a Terragard or Medallion, which also help, but they're not as potent against the problem as a thiophanate methyl. And just quickly, some pictures of viruses that are common in spring greenhouse production. If you're growing Cinetes or Cinerarias, there can be this really sharp yellow mottling that's associated with tomato spotted wilt virus or Impatiens necrotic spot virus on these plants. Recently, we have seen some mums that had tomato spotted wilt virus. Looks completely different. You get browning in the stems when you have a mum infected with tomato spotted wilt. Here's another illustration of that, blackening on the tissue. This came in from out of state, but they were completely confused about what might be going on with one cultivar of mum that was doing this. Lobelias you may have seen, completely different coloring of the symptoms, but the pale tan areas here are from tomato spotted wilt virus. Here's a foliage plant with yellow blotches from Impatiens necrotic spot virus. Here's that look of mosaic on a begonia leaf from Impatiens necrotic spot virus. And you can use the Agdia test strips, which are called immunostrips, to test yourself for these viruses, or you can send samples off to a laboratory in your home state to get them identified. Here you've got symptoms of, obviously it's TSWV because that's the strip that's showing the second line. The blackening in the stems is coming from that virus infection on this Impatiens. Leanne mentioned this book. I just wanted to show it to you again because there's not enough room in one talk to tell you about all the diseases that can affect bedding plants. But if you'd like to learn more, this is a way to get a lot of in-depth information about the pathogens that can affect plants.